You shouldn't stand in the rain, Danny. You'll catch a cold, the girl said softly. And in that single moment, time seemed to collapse in on itself as Daniel Whitmore froze at the edge of his own infinity pool, the storm rolling in behind him, thunder low and distant over the hills of his California estate, because no one had called him that in over a decade. Not like that. Not with that exact tone. Not with that quiet familiarity that didn't belong to a stranger, and certainly not to a pool. Girl he had hired just 3 days ago through an agency he barely remembered contacting. Yet there she was, standing barefoot against the slick marble, rain mist catching in her dark hair, her uniform damp at the edges, her eyes already regretting what she had said, as if the words had slipped out of a place she didn't fully control. And Daniel turned slowly, his chest tightening in a way he hadn't felt in years, studying her face not as an employer, but as a man chasing a ghost he had buried under contracts, investments, and a life rebuilt too carefully to fall apart again. And he told himself it was nothing, just a coincidence, a name overheard, a guess. People knew who he was after all, but the way she avoided his eyes, the way her fingers curled slightly, as if bracing for something, told a different story, one that didn't belong in logic, one that didn't belong in the clean, controlled world he had built after losing everything that actually mattered. And for a brief second he saw another night layered over this one, rain heavier, lights flashing, voices shouting, and a small hand slipping from reach in the chaos of a moment he had replayed 1,000 times without ever changing the ending. And he swallowed hard, pushing the memory down as he stepped closer, his voice steady but edged with something sharper than authority, asking her what she had just said. And the girl blinked, shook her head quickly, forcing a small, apologetic smile that didn't reach her eyes as she muttered that it was nothing, just a phrase her grandmother used to say, that she didn't mean anything by it, that she was sorry if it sounded strange. But Daniel didn't respond right away, because something about the way she said sorry felt practiced, like she had used it too many times to cover something she couldn't afford to reveal. And the rain began to fall harder now, tapping against the water's surface in a steady rhythm that filled the silence between them. And he noticed then the smallest detail, something he couldn't explain why it mattered, the way she glanced up at the sky and flinched, not dramatically, just enough to suggest that storms didn't just make her uncomfortable. They meant something to her, something deeper, something tied to memory. And Daniel felt a quiet, dangerous thought begin to form, one he didn't want to believe but couldn't ignore, because 12 years ago, on a night just like this, his daughter had disappeared into the rain and never come back. And now this girl stood in front of him, knowing a name she shouldn't know, reacting to a storm like it wasn't just weather, and carrying an unspoken tension that didn't belong to a simple life of cleaning pools. And as lightning briefly illuminated the sky, he saw her expression clearly for the first time, not fear, not confusion, but recognition, quickly buried, carefully hidden. And that was the moment Daniel Whitmore realized this wasn't coincidence, it wasn't chance, and whatever truth stood in front of him right now, it had been waiting far longer than he had. Daniel did not walk away that night, even though every instinct he had built over the past 12 years told him to shut it down, to dismiss the moment as coincidence and return to the version of reality that kept him functional. But instead he stood there in the rain a few seconds longer than necessary, watching the girl as she quietly gathered her tools, her movements careful, controlled, almost as if she was trying not to draw attention to herself. And that only made it worse, because people who had nothing to hide did not move like that. They did not measure every glance, every breath, every word. And Daniel had spent years negotiating with people who lied for a living. He knew the difference between nervousness and concealment, and what he saw in her was not fear of losing a job, it was fear of being seen. And that thought followed him inside the house, trailing behind him like the sound of rain against glass as he stood in his office staring at security footage from earlier that day, replaying small moments most people would ignore, the way she hesitated before stepping onto the property, the way she looked at the front entrance not with curiosity, but with familiarity, like someone returning to a place they had not expected to see again. And Daniel leaned closer to the screen when he noticed something else, a brief pause near the hallway leading to the east wing, a part of the house no employee had any reason to recognize. Yet she had slowed down there, just for a second, like a memory had almost surfaced, and he felt that same tightening in his chest again, sharper this time, more dangerous, because it was no longer just a feeling, it was a pattern forming, and patterns meant intention, and intention meant truth waiting underneath. And he did something he had not done in years. Something he had promised himself he would never do again. He opened the file he had locked away, the one labeled with a name he had not spoken out loud since the day everything fell apart. And as the screen filled with old photos, medical records, and notes from investigators who had eventually stopped calling, Daniel found himself comparing details he had memorized long ago. A color, height projections, small physical markers that time could not erase. And then his hand stopped moving when he reached one line he had always remembered, a small birthmark on the inside of the left wrist, faint but distinct, something only family would notice. And Daniel closed the file slowly, exhaling as if he had just stepped into something he could not step out of anymore. Because now there was only one way to know, one simple confirmation that would either end this immediately or change everything. And the next morning he did not call the agency. He did not ask questions through assistants or lawyers. He walked straight out to the pool himself before the sun had fully risen. The air still cool, the sky clear now as if the storm had never happened. And there she was again, already working, already quiet, already trying to disappear into a routine that did not belong to her. And Daniel approached without announcing himself, watching closely as she reached into the water. And when she pulled her hand back, just for a fraction of a second, he saw it. Exactly where the file said it would be, faint but unmistakable against her skin. And that was the moment something shifted inside him. Not hope, not yet, but something stronger than doubt, something that made it impossible to turn away. And when she noticed him standing there, her expression changed instantly, guarded again, careful again. But this time Daniel did not hide his reaction. This time he looked directly at her and asked a question he had not allowed himself to ask anyone in 12 years. Who are you really? And for the first time, she did not answer right away. The question lingered between them longer than it should have, stretching across the quiet morning air as Lily stood completely still, her hand slowly lowering from her wrist as if she already knew what he had seen. And for a brief moment her eyes met his without the usual hesitation, without the careful distance she had been maintaining since the moment she arrived. And that was when Daniel noticed something even more unsettling than before. Not fear, not confusion, but recognition mixed with restraint, like someone holding back words that could not be taken back once spoken. And she finally looked away first, shaking her head slightly as she forced a small breath, and said that she was exactly who her file said she was. Just Lily Brooks, just a temporary worker trying to do her job. Nothing more, nothing hidden, nothing important. But the way she emphasized those last words only made it clearer that none of it was true. And Daniel stepped closer, not aggressive, not demanding, but steady, controlled, the same way he handled every negotiation in his life. Except this was different, because this time the stakes were not financial. They were personal, and he told her calmly that he had seen the mark on her wrist, that he knew it was rare, that it matched something he had not forgotten in 12 years, and Lily's reaction was immediate, not dramatic, but precise. Her shoulders tightened, her breath caught for just a second, and then she turned away as if distance could erase the moment, telling him it was just a birthmark, that a lot of people had similar ones, that he was reading too much into something small. But Daniel did not interrupt her this time. He simply let her speak, let her build her explanation piece by piece until the silence that followed made it collapse on its own. And when she realized he was not going to argue, not going to dismiss it, not going to move on, she slowly stopped talking, and the quiet that settled between them felt heavier than anything she had said. And that was when Daniel changed his approach, not pushing harder, but shifting slightly, asking a different question, one that did not accuse but revealed, asking her why she reacted to the rain the way she did, why she knew that phrase, why she hesitated near parts of the house she had never been shown. And for the first time, Lily did not try to answer immediately, because there was no easy explanation for that, no simple excuse she could fall back on. And the truth hovered just beneath the surface, visible but not yet spoken, and Daniel could see the internal conflict in her, the way her hands tightened around the edge of the pool net, the way her breathing slowed as if she was forcing herself to stay composed. And then she said something that shifted everything again, something quiet, almost careful, asking him if he ever believed that memories could stay with a person even if they did not understand them. And Daniel did not answer right away, because the question itself was already an answer, and Lily continued, her voice steady but distant, explaining that sometimes people felt things they could not explain, that places felt familiar for no reason, that certain words or sounds could make their chest tighten without knowing why. And as she spoke, she never looked at him, like saying it out loud was already more than she was supposed to allow. And Daniel felt something inside him move again, not hope yet, but something dangerously close, because this was no longer coincidence. This was connection trying to break through whatever had been placed between them. And when she finally looked up again, her expression had changed, not open, not fully honest, but no longer completely closed either. And she said quietly that some things were better left alone, that digging into the past did not always bring answers. Sometimes it only made things worse. And that was when Daniel understood that whatever truth she was hiding, she was not hiding it for herself alone. And just as he was about to respond, a voice called out from behind them, sharp, controlled, interrupting the moment with perfect timing. And both of them turned at the same time to see a man standing at the edge of the patio, watching them with a calm expression that felt just slightly too calculated to be coincidence. The man standing at the edge of the patio did not raise his voice, yet his presence alone was enough to shift the entire atmosphere, as if something unseen had just stepped into the space between them. And Daniel recognized him instantly. Jonathan Reeves, his personal attorney for over a decade, the one person who had managed every legal detail of his life since the night everything fell apart, the one who had handled the aftermath, the investigations, the reports, the closure that had never truly felt like closure. And Jonathan offered a polite, controlled smile as he walked closer, his shoes barely making a sound against the stone, his eyes briefly scanning Lily before returning to Daniel with a calm familiarity that almost felt rehearsed, asking if everything was all right, if there was an issue with the staff, if he needed anything handled. And Daniel did not answer immediately because something about the timing felt too precise, too convenient, as if the moment had been interrupted not by chance but by intention. And he glanced at Lily, who had gone completely still again, her posture tightening in a way that was different from before, not uncertainty this time, but recognition of a different kind, sharper, more alert, like someone who had just seen a piece of a puzzle fall into place that they had been trying not to acknowledge. And Daniel noticed it, the subtle shift. The way her eyes did not meet Jonathan's directly but also did not fully avoid him. And that was enough to confirm what he had been starting to suspect, that whatever truth she was holding back, it was connected to more than just her past. It involved someone else, someone who already knew more than they should. And Daniel finally responded, his tone measured but deliberate, saying that he was simply asking a few questions, nothing that required legal attention. But Jonathan did not step back, did not dismiss it. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, maintaining that same calm expression as he said that sometimes small questions could lead to unnecessary complications, especially when they involved employees who might not fully understand the situation they were in. And the words sounded neutral on the surface, but the meaning underneath was anything but. And Lily lowered her gaze at that moment, her fingers tightening slightly around the handle of the net, as if the weight of the conversation had just increased in a way she had been trying to avoid. And Daniel felt something shift again, this time sharper, more defined, because now the pattern was no longer forming. It was visible, clear enough to follow. And he took one more step forward, placing himself slightly between Jonathan and Lily, not in a confrontational way, but enough to break the line of control that had just been established. And he said quietly that he would decide what questions were necessary. And for a brief second, Jonathan's expression changed, not enough for most people to notice. But Daniel had spent years reading micro-expressions in high-stakes negotiations, and he saw it, the smallest flicker of resistance, quickly hidden behind professionalism. And that was when Daniel understood something that made the situation far more serious than he had initially believed. This was not just about a girl with familiar traits. This was about information that had been managed, controlled, possibly even altered. And Jonathan shifted his attention to Lily then, his tone still polite but carrying a subtle weight as he addressed her directly, reminding her that she was here to work, that personal matters should not interfere with her responsibilities. and Lily nodded slightly without speaking. But the silence itself felt like a response, one that carried far more meaning than words, and Daniel watched the exchange carefully, noticing how neither of them needed to say anything explicit for the tension to exist, and that was when he made a decision, one that would move this from suspicion to certainty. And he turned back to Jonathan and said that he would be running a routine background verification on all staff moving forward, including updated identification and medical confirmation, a standard procedure, nothing unusual, but the effect was immediate, subtle but undeniable, because for the first time, Jonathan did not respond right away, and in that brief pause, Daniel saw everything he needed to see, not proof yet, but enough to know that whatever truth had been buried for 12 years was not lost. It had been kept hidden, and the person standing in front of him might have been protecting that secret all along. The air did not return to normal after that moment. It only became quieter in a way that made every movement feel more deliberate, more observed, and Daniel could sense that whatever balance had existed before was now gone, replaced by something far more fragile, because now everyone in that space knew that a line had been crossed, even if no one had said it out loud, and Jonathan recovered quickly as expected, offering a composed nod and agreeing that additional verification was always a wise precaution, his tone smooth, controlled, almost reassuring, but Daniel was no longer listening to the words. He was watching the reactions, and Lily's response was the one that mattered most, because instead of relief or confusion, there was a brief moment where something else appeared in her expression, something close to conflict, like she had just been given a chance she had not expected but was not sure she could take. And she looked down again, avoiding both of them now, as if staying invisible was the only safe position left, and Daniel realized then that pushing too hard in this moment would not give him answers. It would only make her retreat further, and if she was holding on to something important, forcing it out too quickly could make it disappear entirely. So he stepped back slightly, not in surrender, but in strategy, allowing the situation to breathe just enough for the tension to settle without breaking. And he told Jonathan that he would handle the rest personally, that there was no need for immediate action, and this time the pause that followed was longer, heavier, because it shifted control in a way that could not be ignored, and Jonathan's smile returned. But it was thinner now, more precise, as he acknowledged the decision and said he would make himself available if needed, then turned and walked away with the same measured pace he had arrived with, leaving behind a silence that felt even more revealing than his presence had been. And for a few seconds neither Daniel nor Lily moved, as if both of them were waiting for something to settle inside their own thoughts before speaking again. And when Daniel finally looked at her, he did not ask another question right away. He simply said that she did not have to answer anything yet, that he was not going to force her into a conversation she was not ready to have. And Lily's reaction to that was immediate, but subtle. Her shoulders relaxed just slightly, her grip on the net loosening as if some of the pressure had been lifted, but her eyes remained distant, still guarded, still holding something back that had not changed. And she asked quietly why he was doing this, why he cared so much about something that could just be coincidence. And Daniel considered the question carefully before answering, because the truth was not simple. It was not something that could be explained in a single sentence, but he chose the part that mattered most, saying that some things did not feel like coincidence, not when they repeated, not when they connected in ways that could not be ignored, and that he had spent too many years accepting answers that never felt complete, and he was no longer willing to do that again. And Lily listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable for a moment before she turned her gaze toward the surface of the pool, watching the slight ripples move across the water, as if they held some kind of answer she could not say out loud. And then she spoke, more carefully this time, saying that if he continued looking into this, he might find things he would not be able to undo, that not every truth brought peace, some only brought consequences. And Daniel felt the weight of that warning, not as a threat, but as something genuine, something that came from experience rather than fear, and instead of stepping away, he nodded once, acknowledging it, and said that he understood, but that not knowing had its own consequences too. And for a brief moment, their eyes met again, and this time the distance between them felt smaller, not because the answers were clearer, but because the silence between them now carried the same question, one that neither of them was ready to fully face yet. but both knew was already too real to ignore. Daniel did not bring up the conversation again that morning, not because the questions had faded, but because he understood now that timing mattered more than pressure. And as Lily returned to her routine, moving along the edge of the pool with careful precision, he stepped back into the house with a clarity he had not felt in years, because for the first time, this was no longer about chasing something lost. It was about uncovering something hidden, and those were two very different paths. And later that afternoon, Daniel sat alone in his office, the same room where he had reviewed countless contracts and decisions worth millions of dollars. Yet nothing in that space had ever carried the same weight as what he was about to do. And instead of going through his usual channels, instead of involving Jonathan or any of the people who had managed his affairs for years, he opened a secure line to a private firm he had not contacted in over a decade, a firm that specialized in quiet investigations, the kind that did not appear in official records, the kind that answered questions without drawing attention. And when the call connected, Daniel did not hesitate. He provided Lily's full name, the agency that had sent her, the timeline of her employment, and then he added one more instruction that made the request different. From anything routine, he asked for verification beyond standard databases, medical history, identity records, and most importantly, any inconsistencies that suggested alteration, and the voice on the other end acknowledged without surprise, as if they had handled cases like this before, and promised an initial report within 48 hours. And when the call ended, Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at nothing in particular as the silence settled around him, because now the process had begun, and whatever truth existed would not stay hidden much longer. But even as he told himself that, a part of him remained cautious, because Lily's warning had not sounded like fear of being exposed. It had sounded like concern for what exposure might cause, and that distinction mattered more than he wanted to admit. And outside, the sun had fully taken over the sky, the storm from the night before leaving no visible trace. Yet the air still carried a faint heaviness, like something unresolved lingering beneath the surface, and Daniel eventually stood, stepping back outside, not to question her again, but simply to observe, because sometimes the answers people avoided saying could be found in the things they did not realize they were revealing. And Lily was still there, finishing her work, her movements steady but slightly slower than before, as if she was thinking through something with every step. And when she noticed him, she did not look away this time, but she did not approach either, holding that same careful distance that had defined every interaction between them. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, until Lily finally broke the silence in a way Daniel had not expected, asking him quietly if he had ever trusted someone completely, and later realized that trust had been used to control what he believed, and the question landed differently than the others, because it was no longer abstract, it was pointed, intentional, and Daniel did not answer immediately, because the truth was that he had built his entire life on trust placed in the right people, or at least who he believed were the right people, and the possibility that one of them had shaped his reality. Without his knowledge was not something he had allowed himself to consider until now, and Lily seemed to understand that hesitation, because she nodded slightly, as if confirming something to herself rather than expecting a response. And then she added that sometimes the truth was not erased, it was redirected, made to look like something else so that no one would question it. And Daniel felt that statement settle into place with everything he had observed so far, not as proof, but as a direction. And before he could respond, Lily turned away again, finishing her task as if the conversation had never happened. But this time the silence she left behind was not empty. It was filled with meaning, and Daniel knew that whatever he was about to uncover, it was no longer just about finding answers. It was about understanding why those answers had been hidden in the first place. The report did not arrive in 48 hours like promised. It came sooner, and that alone told Daniel that what they had found was not routine, because firms like that did not move faster unless something required immediate attention. And as he sat at his desk late that evening, the house quiet around him, the file opened with a level of precision that matched the tone of everything that had led to this moment. And the first few pages looked normal enough: identification records, employment history, verified documents that painted a consistent picture of Lily Brooks as a young woman who had moved between small jobs across different states. No major gaps, no obvious inconsistencies, exactly the kind of background designed to avoid deeper scrutiny. But Daniel kept reading, because he knew that surface-level clarity often meant deeper layers were being managed. And then he reached the section marked Supplemental Verification, and that was where the pattern began to break. Not dramatically, but enough to matter, because while the records existed, their origin points did not align the way they should, timestamps that matched too perfectly, issuing authorities that traced back to intermediaries rather than direct filings, and most importantly, a note that certain medical records had been reconstructed rather than archived, meaning they were based on existing data but not original entries. And Daniel felt that same controlled tension return as he read further, because the report did not claim fraud, it did not make accusations, but it outlined something far more precise. The identity was real, but it had been adjusted, refined, curated in a way that removed any conflicting elements. And that alone would have been enough to raise concern. But then came the final detail, one that shifted everything from possibility to probability, a cross-reference that had only a partial match, incomplete, flagged due to limited access, but still present, indicating that at some point in the past, before the current identity had been fully established, there was a record tied to a different name, one that had been sealed under legal authority, and the firm had not been able to access it fully without authorization that Daniel himself would need to provide, and he leaned back slowly, the weight of that information settling in, because now the question was no longer whether something had been hidden, it was how far the concealment had gone and who had the authority to make it happen, and his thoughts returned immediately to Jonathan, not because of suspicion alone, but because of access, because very few people in his life had the reach to alter records at that level and ensure they remained untouched for years. And yet, even with that realization, Daniel did not act immediately, because Lily's words echoed again, about truth being redirected rather than erased, and he understood now that forcing the final piece too quickly could trigger consequences he did not yet fully understand, and instead, he made a different choice, one that shifted the direction of everything that would come next. And the following morning, he asked Lily to meet him, not at the pool, not in a place tied to her role, but inside the house, in a quiet sitting room that overlooked the garden, neutral, controlled, and when she walked in, she hesitated just slightly at the doorway, as if stepping into that space carried a different kind of meaning than anything that had happened outside. And Daniel did not begin with questions this time. He simply placed the file on the table between them, not opened, not explained, just present, and said calmly that he knew her identity had been altered, not erased, that there were records tied to a past that did not match the one she had been living, and that he had the ability to uncover the rest. But he wanted to hear it from her first, because whatever truth existed, it belonged to her before it belonged to any report, and Lily did not sit right away. She remained standing for a moment, looking at the file as if it represented something she had been trying to keep distant for a very long time. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, not uncertain, but careful in a different way, and she said that if he opened that file completely, there would be no going back, not for him, not for her. And Daniel held her gaze steadily, understanding that this was the moment everything would either surface or be lost again. And he replied simply that he was not afraid of the truth. And for the first time, Lily's expression shifted in a way that was no longer guarded, but conflicted, because this time, she was not deciding whether to hide something, she was deciding whether to reveal everything. Lily finally sat down, but not fully at ease, her posture still holding a quiet tension as if every word she was about to say had already been weighed against consequences she had lived with for years, and she kept her eyes on the file for a moment longer before looking up at Daniel, not as an employee, not even as someone hiding anymore, but as someone standing at the edge of a truth she had carried alone for far too long. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, not emotional, not dramatic, just honest in a way that made every word land with more weight than anything she had said before. And she told him that she remembered more than she ever admitted, not everything perfectly, not every detail, but enough to know that her life did not begin the way the record said it did, enough to know that there was a night defined by rain, by confusion, by a sense of being taken from one place and placed into another without understanding why. And Daniel did not interrupt, because this was the first time she was not holding back, and he knew that even a single question could break the flow of what she was finally allowing to surface. and Lily continued, explaining that for years those memories had felt like fragments, disconnected, something she could not prove or explain, and every time she tried to ask about them, she was told the same thing, that memory could be unreliable, that what she felt was not necessarily what had happened, that she should focus on the life she had instead of questioning it. And at first she believed it, because she had no reason not to. But as she got older, the inconsistencies became harder to ignore. The way certain places felt familiar without explanation. The way certain sounds or words triggered reactions she could not control. And eventually, she realized that it was not her memory that was unclear, it was the information around it that had been shaped to keep her from connecting it. And Daniel felt a quiet realization forming as he listened, because everything she was describing aligned with the patterns in the report, not erased identity, but redirected identity, carefully maintained over time. And Lily paused briefly, her hands resting still now, as if she had reached the point where saying more would change everything. And when she spoke again, her voice lowered slightly, not out of fear, but because what came next was no longer just about her. And she said that she was not supposed to tell him any of this, that from the moment she started remembering, she was given a choice, not directly, not in a way that sounded like a threat, but in a way that made the consequences clear. She could either accept the life she had been given and stop asking questions, or she could lose the stability she had built and face outcomes she was not prepared for. And Daniel understood immediately that this was not something a random guardian or agency could enforce. This required resources, influence, long-term control, and there were very few people in his world who had access to that level of power. And Lily finally looked directly at him then, her expression no longer guarded but resolved. And she said that she had stayed quiet not because she did not want answers, but because she was trying to protect something, not just herself, but him as well. Because the moment the truth became fully visible, it would not just expose what happened to her, it would expose who had been shaping that truth from the beginning. And Daniel felt that statement settle into place with everything he had uncovered, because now the missing piece was no longer hidden. It was simply waiting to be acknowledged. And he asked her quietly who it was, not with urgency, not with anger, but with a certainty that the answer already existed between them. And Lily did not hesitate this time. But before she could speak, the door behind them opened slowly, and a familiar voice entered the room with calm precision, saying that some questions were better handled with all the facts present. And both of them turned to see Jonathan standing there once again, his expression composed. But this time, there was no effort to hide that he already knew exactly what had been said. Jonathan closed the door behind him with a quiet precision that felt more final than the sound itself. And for the first time since he had entered any of these moments, he did not pretend to be unaware. He did not ask what was going on or offer to assist. Instead, he stepped forward calmly and looked directly at Daniel, then briefly at Lily, as if acknowledging that the space for partial truths had already passed. And Daniel remained seated, his expression steady but no longer uncertain, because everything had aligned now. The timing, the access, the control over information, and most of all the way Jonathan carried himself in this moment, not defensive, not surprised, but prepared, and that alone confirmed what Daniel had already begun to accept. And Jonathan spoke in the same measured tone he had always used, explaining that what Daniel had started to uncover was not entirely incorrect, but not entirely complete either, and that the situation was more complex than it appeared, not a simple matter of deception, but a series of decisions made under circumstances that had required careful handling. And Daniel did not interrupt, because he understood now that this was not about extracting answers. It was about hearing the version of truth that had been managed for years. And Jonathan continued, saying that after the night, everything changed. When the situation became unstable and unpredictable, there were risks that extended beyond a missing child, risks tied to business, to legal exposure, to individuals who could have used that vulnerability in ways that would have caused lasting damage. And in that environment, certain decisions had to be made quickly, decisions that prioritized long-term protection over immediate resolution. And Daniel felt a quiet tension build as he listened, because the explanation was structured, logical even, but it did not change the reality of what had been done. And Jonathan acknowledged that as well, stating that when Lily was found, the situation was not as simple as returning her immediately, because by then, Too many variables had shifted, too many people were aware, and the safest course of action, the one that minimized risk across all fronts, was to remove her from the situation entirely and construct a controlled identity that could be maintained without drawing attention. And Lily's presence in the room changed at that point, because hearing it spoken out loud removed any remaining uncertainty. And Daniel turned to her slowly, the weight of 12 years, compressing into a single realization, not lost, not gone, but kept at a distance under the justification of protection, and Jonathan did not deny it. He simply said that the intention had never been to erase her, but to ensure that both she and Daniel could continue without the complications that the truth might have brought at the time, and that over the years, as stability returned, the situation became more difficult to reverse without reopening risks that had already been contained. And Daniel stood then, not with anger, but with a clarity that carried far more weight, because the explanation did not justify the outcome, it only explained the process, and he said quietly that protection without choice was not protection, it was control, and for the first time, Jonathan did not respond immediately, because there was nothing in that statement to correct, and Lily spoke next, her voice steady, no longer uncertain, saying that she had been given pieces of the truth over time, enough to understand what had happened, but always with the same condition, that some things were better left unchanged, that returning would disrupt more than it restored. And Daniel looked at her, really looked this time, not as a possibility, not as a question, but as someone who had been part of his life all along in a way he had never been allowed to see. And he asked her one final question, not about the past, not about what had been done, but about what she wanted now, because that was the one thing no one else had the right to decide. And the room fell completely silent as Lily took a breath, the weight of everything finally shifting into a single moment that would define what came next. And she looked between both of them before answering softly that she did not want to be hidden anymore.